The first was actually Mesopotamia. You'd think it would be Egypt because Egypt is in Africa, but no, Mesopotamia was the first place where agriculture really developed. Egypt was like shortly after, but it outlived Mesopotamia by a lot, so it made up for that. So China was the last because it is the furthest away and because it is separated from other river valley civilizations by like mountains and desert and land that's really hard to cross. There were also river valley civilizations in the Americas, and those were like absolutely the most isolated by far from everybody else. But in terms of like the Afro-Eurasian landmass, it was China. All right, so as we go through river valley civilizations, please keep in mind the way that they are affected by physical geography. How physical geography, how like the place, the climate, the terrain, the personality of the rivers even, and you'll know what I mean later, how all of that affected the specific kind of civilization that grew up, how it affected the way people thought, state stability, all of that stuff. So the interplay between physical geography and like these specific cultures, keep that in mind. That's a theme that we're going to have going through. And remember that like throughout this week, we've been talking about the peopling of the world, right? People originated in Africa. We were hunter-gatherers, nomads for like thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And then we start to learn how to farm. And then everything happens. Specialization, food surplus, complex institutions, cultures, states, empires, boom, boom, boom. So without further ado, please prepare to take notes. We have 2 slides for notes today, and this is the first. So please title your notes for the day, River Valley Civilizations. Today we are just going to introduce them. Going to get a big broad overview, and then we will look at specific cases as the unit trudges on. River Valley Civilizations, the very first civilizations. So we know that the earliest cities formed in river valleys starting around 3,500 BCE, a long time ago, but also a long time distant from the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution, when farming was even developed, that was in 10,000 BCE. We don't get the rise of the first civilizations until thousands of years later. And like, sit for a minute with how long of a time that is. I just think it's important to think about. So thousands of years later, we get the rise of the very first civilizations. And they arose in river valleys for the very good reason that when rivers flood, they water crops. And they water crops not just with any old water, but with nutrient-rich water from the rivers, which makes crops grow. I use the word irrigate a lot. If you don't know what it means, please write it down. It just means to water crops by bringing in water from rivers, by like building canals, anything other than relying on rainfall. And so if you have farmland near a river and the river floods, especially if it floods in a way that's predictable and you can plan around it, then the river does a lot of that work for you. And then you can have big food surpluses to support big populations. And that's when you get this explosion of civilization. The formation of gatherings of settled people in one area, which we're going to call a city, eventually, over time, required more complex systems than people had had to that point. They required government, for example. At a certain point, when you get a certain number of people all in one space, it's very helpful to have somebody directing everybody's actions, even if everybody has the best of intentions, right? So to build irrigation ditches, to build sewage systems and roads, to build complex things that no individual person would want to do all by themselves, but we as a society need to do collectively. People need a leader. It's helpful. So the rise of cities led to the rise of governments. Infrastructure is a word that we're going to use a lot as well. So if you do not know it, please write it down. Infrastructure is the basic, like, physical stuff, physical and organizational structures and facilities that we need for society to work, like roads, power supplies nowadays, that sort of thing. Back then, irrigation ditches and, like, not paved roads, but, you know, roads. In addition, at some point, law and order becomes pretty useful. So as people are inventing private property and they have things that are theirs and not other people's, it helps to have a government to provide some sort of system of justice so you don't end up in, like, a constant cycle of revenge if somebody steals somebody else's stuff or, like, kills somebody out of anger, whatever. So cities form around river valleys. River valleys irrigate crops well with a lot of nutrient-rich stuff. Crops grow, food surplus grows, population grows. Then you get cities, governments, infrastructure, recognized hallmarks of civilized life. There were several river valley civilizations that developed at slightly different times around this, like, general ancient period. And you will be required to find them on a map. So if you want to write down the names, that would be good. Egypt developed along the Nile River. We're going to look at that next week. Love Egypt. It's exactly what you're picturing in your head, except it's a civilization that lasted about 3,000 years, which is, again, a really long time. America's only been around for less than 300, for example, or at least the United States. People were here before. Right, so we've got Egypt along the Nile River in Africa. In the Middle East and modern-day Iraq, we have Mesopotamia. In India, we have the Indus River Valley. In China, we have the Shang River Valley civilization that developed around the Yellow River, and there's a picture of it on the top right of the slide. You can see why it's called the Yellow River. It looks like it would be nutrient-rich. And then in the Americas, we also have river valley civilizations develop, but in complete isolation from the ones that came up in Africa and Europe and Asia, just because of the separation of oceans. So in the Americas, we have the Olmecs in Mexico and the Chavin civilization in Peru. These river valley civilizations very soon needed a way to establish order, to keep things under control, to keep chaos from happening. And just to illustrate the point, you guys know that when you get a mass of people, like students, in a room and there's no authority figure, sometimes crazy things happen. Schools are like little microcosms of society. So it's the same in society. When you get too many people, eventually a system of order is needed, or those people don't survive as a society together anymore. And as a system of order, early river valley civilizations really leaned into the social hierarchy. So the states that emerged helped reinforce the inequalities that developed in the Neolithic Revolution with the social hierarchy, which was thought to be like the key to an orderly civilization. This was something that it was a structure that people accepted as a necessary part of life. And most people didn't question it. It would have sucked to be on the bottom for sure, but you wouldn't have a lot of people with our modern mindset of, we're on the bottom of the pyramid, how do we get to the top? It would be more like, we're on the bottom, back to the farm, this sucks, we're hungry, you know. All right, so in this hierarchical society, the specifics are different for different river valley civilizations, but the general categories of who's at the top, who's in the middle, who's in the bottom are generally the same. At the very top, we had a ruler or a king, illustrated by a cute little puppy with a crown on his head on the slide. And with the king, or very close to the king, you'd have religious figures. So like the government and the church often worked hand in hand. The government, a little more power than the church, but they were, you know, the very, very top. In the middle of the social hierarchy, you'd have elites, people with political power, bureaucrats, bureaucrats. I'm going to say it like 5 times because it's a French word, so it doesn't look like the way it's spelled. Bureaucrats, from the French word for desk. Bureaucrats are people who work for the government, who do government jobs without themselves having any individual power to make decisions. So like the people at the driver's license office are bureaucrats. They can give you a license if you qualify for it, but they don't get to decide based on how they're feeling whether or not you get one. And then also specialized classes, people with skills beyond farming that take time and training to learn, like weapons makers, artisans, merchants, scribes, people who could write. And then all the way at the very bottom, we had agricultural laborers, tons of them. So like peasants, farmers, and slaves and servants. Back then also, just to have a check on our mindset, when we say slaves, that wasn't necessarily a racial thing until relatively recently in history. Slaves were often people of land that you conquered and brought back. It wasn't necessarily like a color thing back then. These hierarchies and state power were often legitimized or made valid by religion in the ancient world. So, like I said, the church and the government tended to work hand in hand. And in addition to the hierarchy, these early river valley civilizations created order, not just through government, but through centralized government. So like with one person with all of the power. Eventually by writing codes of law, we're going to read the very first one next week, and by making rules to promote order. This made it possible for rulers to rule over increasingly large distances, and to restate the church and government thing, often laws were connected to some sort of divine or religious origin, which made it more likely that people would want to follow them. And the social hierarchy that you're looking at is of Egypt, I believe, the pharaoh on the top. So there are 4 major river valley civilizations in Afro-Eurasia. And next week we'll be looking at Egypt and Mesopotamia. And you guys will be looking at the Indus River Valley a little bit tomorrow, and then China next week. When we look at these river valley civilizations, we should think about like what they have in common, what's different, and how physical geography helps influence those differences. And because I know you guys like pictures, we can have some picture time too. So you are looking at pictures of Mesopotamian civilization. We'll go through this more next week. Mesopotamia was called the Fertile Crescent. It developed between 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, in modern-day Iraq. Mesopotamia is incredibly flat, so easy to invade. And the rivers were violent and unpredictable, and as a result, life was a little bit chaotic. Mesopotamia has some pretty great flood stories. And if you remember that the founder of Judaism came from this part of the world, and you know anything about the Old Testament of the Bible or the Torah, you know that the story of Noah's flood is kind of a big part of that story. And so it kind of makes sense that he came from a part of the world that flooded in violent and unpredictable and kind of scary ways. Mesopotamia invented writing. It was called cuneiform. There's a picture on the left in the middle. They had big churches called ziggurats, which is the picture next to the writing. And they were home to like a couple of different states. There were Sumerian city-states, and then there was like the Babylonian Empire that's bigger and more famous. And we will be looking at Hammurabi's code, the law code from that empire. Next up, Egypt, fascinating civilization, emerged along the Nile River and really kind of stayed near the Nile River. Didn't really expand out very far, and for a very good reason, because it's surrounded by desert. Egyptian civilization lasted thousands of years, thousands. I don't want to get this wrong, but I think Cleopatra, who was a real person, existed closer in time to the first Pizza Hut than she did to when the big famous pyramids were built. So very, very long-lasting, very stable civilization. And we'll be looking at how the predictability of the Nile River combined with the natural defensive barriers of the desert surrounding helped contribute to that stability. In the Indus River Valley civilization, that river is beautiful. We've already seen a little bit of the civilization in our studies of Hinduism. And we'll be looking a little bit more tomorrow, so I don't want to spoil it, but like, look at the pictures, beautiful. And then ancient China emerged along the Yellow River, starting with the Shang Dynasty, where you start to see a lot of the hallmarks that we associate with Chinese culture start to develop, including the writing. China is one of the most long-lasting kind of continuous cultural forces in world history. And so it's fascinating really to be able to start at the very beginning and see the roots of a story that, you know, we can see continuing. And that's the Yellow River. I think the Yellow River is super pretty too. Pandemic vibes, man. I want to travel. Okay, so let's see what I want you to have learned. Can somebody tell me why civilizations developed around rivers in the chat? For irrigation. Yay, good job, Arlene and Isabella, for irrigation. It's easier to water plants when you don't have to carry water. Water's heavy. Good job.